I never thought I'd say this, but I need a break from making moving parts and giant wings in my cosplay. Yeah, that felt even uncomfortable to say. Look, moving parts and ridiculous giant concepts are always going to be my bread and butter, but I think this time I really want to make something a little bit more normal. Alright, that's a lie. This project is not going to be normal. Maybe more human? Also a lie. We're going for like vampire and fae vibes combined. Okay, this project is going to be a little bit more humanoid and a little bit less weird than giant catbirds, moss-covered hooves, and glittery pink spider demons. Hello, I'm Miss Twisted. I do cosplay and makeup and other weird and whimsical stuff. And this time round we are making a big flouncy vampire ball gown for a big fancy photo shoot in a big fancy ballroom with a bunch of amazing cosplayers and photographers. So, quick backstory stuff. I've actually been planning on making some sort of vampire ball gown for almost a year now. I originally saw an ad for a vampire themed ball ages ago and just thought the idea was really cool. And I'm no stranger to gothy styles. I went from being an edgy emo kid to a fully fledged gothling to whatever weird comfy hybrid style I have now. Even in my hardcore goth days, I was super into the idea of using white clothes in a gothic style. Emily Autumn was my style icon, and I loved the idea of wearing like an all-white outfit standing out in a sea of black clothes. So I kind of want to tap into some of that style for this one, and I was really sold on the idea of red and white for my ball gown colors. Anyway, a couple of months ago I was invited to be part of this group of cosplayers and photographers for this fantasy masquerade ball gown sort of photo shoot. So by this point I'd already started hoarding and squirreling away different red and white laces and trims and fabrics, and now I had the perfect excuse to use them. I was genuinely so excited to start on this one because I think I'd kind of gone through my Hasbin Hotel hype, but I was itching to make like some sort of original design that taps into more fantasy elements. And I was especially excited to actually sew something and do a project that doesn't involve doing any spray painting or power tools out in my freezing cold garage. Now, full disclosure, I'm refilming parts of my intro for this one after the whole thing has already been finished. So I do want to apologize sincerely to any seamstresses or cosplayers who know things about sewing, because the amount of like illegal sewing and cosplay techniques in this video will alarm and upset you. There's going to be unfinished seams, glue where there should be stitching, the wrong terms used. Seriously, I should go to cosplay jail for this dress. I'm actually not sorry at all. I really needed a project that I could just have fun with. Oh, and just as another excuse for all of my heinous sewing shortcuts, I had 7 days from beginning to end to finish this project, which I might add is no one's fault but my own because I started it so late. So there were like a couple of different points of inspiration that came up for me. I was looking mostly for white clothes that had lots of red details. Robert One has done a bunch of different clothes in his collections that use red, particularly like crystals and beadwork, to almost suggest wounds or blood, but without being like on the nose about it, you know? I actually found quite a different range of different clothes and concepts that tapped into this same feeling. Aside from that, I am gonna go into this without really having any solid plans. I know I want a ball gown with some sort of corseted bodice and a really big fluffy skirt. I like the idea of these different tiers of flounces because it's going to give me a lot of different edges where I can start to put some of that red detail. It kind of reminds me of those flowers that are white with those little red rims. So that is essentially everything that I went into this project with. I'm going to throw it back to past Charlotte, who is going to go through some of the little bits and pieces I had for this project. Also, apologies in advance for the constantly changing lighting in this video. I don't really know how to use a camera outside of the automatic settings, and my camera was struggling to find a balance between the white of the fabric and my pale ass face. So yep, sorry, you'll have to put up with it until I can figure out how to use cameras. Okay, base fabric, I have a ton of just plain pure white cotton sateen, and I cannot tell you guys how hard it was to find a white cotton sateen that wasn't off-white or cream or ivory. I've also got some plain white poplin so that I can cut into this for my mock-up and not cut into the expensive stuff until I need it. I've got about 4 pieces of red lace here. These are just like mostly leftover from when I did my Tantasila cosplay last year. This is the hoop skirt that I've been using for my Stella cosplay, so I'm just gonna reuse that here. I think I pulled out some like fabric dye from my stash, but I don't think I'm going to use these, to be honest, because I think if I have the white fabric fabric and dye bits of it, it's gonna start giving like blood-soaked vibes in a more literal way, and I don't think I want to go that route. I got a good helping of red ribbon, and I've got a decent chunk of a bunch of different red trims. I've got a handful of white lace trims as well. I don't think I want to use any white lace, but I might see if this can take to the dye, so maybe I will use that stuff after all. White ribbon, white bias binding, red thread, white thread, you know, all the usual stuff. Now, I have been trawling through op shops and clearance places and online sales, so I've got a really good handful of different kinds of like red crystals and beads. Look how many beads are in this thing. This is apparently traditional glass check beads that I got for like $5. I have no idea if that's a bargain or not, but there is so many in there. Now, I'm not usually one for making detailed solid plans. I usually just like to jump in and see how things go. So we're just gonna jump straight in with getting a circle skirt going for the bottom of the ball gown.
I love circle skirts because they are so easy. It's basically one giant donut worth of fabric. I'm making my mock-up by using 2 semicircles worth of fabric out of this poplin. If you want an actual tutorial on how to do circle skirts, I recommend treasury.com or buyhandlondon.com. Both of these websites do these amazing circle skirt calculators that help you build out exactly what your pattern will look like. But for me, as per usual, I'm just kind of winging it. I've been folding this one up a couple of times into this cone shape just because it'll help me make sure that when I cut this bottom part, it's kind of as even as possible without using measurements. Honestly, I have no idea why I'm so averse to using measurements or patterns. Once I had 2 semicircles cut out of my poplin, I'm going to pin them together on one end. Once I sew both of these semicircles together, I'm going to have my full giant circle. Now, this part is just the mock-up to kind of test the measurements and the shape of the circle skirt, so I'm not too concerned about like having perfectly neat stitches. Let's just plonk my giant donut of fabric on my mannequin.
So seeing the circle skirt mock-up on the hoop skirt does remind me that this is like a relatively cheap hoop skirt, and there are bits particularly towards the bottom where I can like see the line of the hoop. So I think I'm actually going to also make like a tulle petticoat of some sort in that same circle skirt shape, which does mean I need to go and buy some more fabric, but that actually works out quite well because I was checking yesterday and I only have about 5 meters of that cotton sateen, which is absolutely not enough. All right, so the original cotton sateen that I got was from a place called Done Cheap Fabrics, and that is like an hour drive from my house. I'm just not about that kind of drive today. So I went to Spotlight instead. It is like a 10-minute drive from my house, so way closer. They did not have a cotton sateen in a pure white, only had like an off-white sort of thing. What they did have is like a really nice delustered satin, which looks pretty close to the cotton sateen, so I can probably use both and they're not really going to be very noticeably different. I think this might be a little bit lighter as well, so maybe that'll mean it'll hold the flounce and the shape a bit better. I don't know. And then I also got a absolute ton of like standard cheap tulle. So basically I'm going to do 2 more circle skirts using that little mock-up. One of them with the tulle and one of them with my cotton sateen, and I'm hopefully going to save the delustered satin for all the flouncy layers on top. We'll see how that goes.
So I realized I was cutting out like half of the shot when filming in my tiny little office. So we're moving out into the lounge room. Now you can get a proper look at what my little semicircle donut worth of fabric looks like. I've got my tulle folded over twice here so that I can cut out 2 pieces at once that both match roughly that semicircle shape. As you can see, I still did not buy enough tulle because I've got a piece of my mock-up just hanging off the edge here. But my hope was having it a tiny bit shorter on one end isn't really going to make much difference to the petticoat layer, because I sure as heck was not going to do another trip back to the shops. Once again, I am sewing my little semicircle pieces together just along that edge here. I've never used tulle. I don't know if there's supposed to be like a wrong side or a right side to it, but I'm not doing any kind of like French seams or anything on this. I'm literally just straight stitching down one side. My only concern is holding everything together into that circle skirt shape. And the clumsy cutting of corners continues in the waistband, because I am going to sew the waist section directly to the hoop skirt. I did remember to use at least a zigzag stitch so that it doesn't affect the elasticity of the waistband on the hoop skirt. I feel the need to apologize yet again to any seamstresses watching.
My lovely tulle petticoat has now been sewn onto the hoop skirt. It's not like the neatest, evenest stitching ever, and I'm definitely going to have to fix up the hemline. That is a problem for future Charlotte.
Okay, cutting out the 3rd circle skirt on my cotton sateen for my base layer. This time I've done my stitch right along the middle of the selvage. I'm going to cut off the excess right up close to that stitch line. Now I've sewn my 2 semicircles with the wrong sides together instead of the right sides together so that I can turn this inside out like a bag lining and then sew along that seam again. Essentially, I'm encasing this raw edge inside its own seam. I think this is similar to like a French seam. I'm not too familiar with all the terms though, so I might be wrong. People who know sewing, help us out in the comments here, and also feel free to to scold me for all of my incorrect techniques. The third stitch line is with that seam opened up, pushed to one side so that I can sew down on one side of my stitch line. I'm basically just trying to make sure that this seam sits flat. Look, I know I'm glossing over a lot of these sections. That is because I legitimately have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just kind of repeating what I've picked up by osmosis by watching other cosplayers work.
The tulle petticoat was definitely the right move because everything over this kind of sits now like it's floating as opposed to just a bunch of fabric draped over a bunch of hoops. Once again, I'm leaving the hemlines all for future Charlotte to worry about. I kind of just want to get like all of the main shapes down before I try and figure out how everything's going to get sewn together. So now I've got to try and figure out what kind of layers I want for some flounces. From my extensive sewing knowledge, i.e. my Google search 2 days ago, flounces are similar to ruffles except that where they attach to the main body is relatively sitting flat and then you have those beautiful curves towards like the edges. If that doesn't make sense to you, hopefully you'll see what I mean once I put it together.
I was so excited to cut into this delicious delustered satin. I didn't even bother with mock-ups for this section. I did kind of reference my original circle skirt mock-up, but instead of the standard shape, I'm purposefully making it a little bit shorter on one end, hoping that some of the little folds will sort of cascade down into the longer sections at the back of the skirt. And with the goal of adding some extra volume at the back, I made another semicircle of my satin that I'm going to attach my two uneven semicircle flounce pieces to as well.
I think that like if I knew how to use an overlocker or at least owned one, this is probably one of those seams that I just would have used an overlocker for to start us off. Overlocker? I hardly know her. I'm so sorry. It sounded better in my head. So I've got that thing pinned around. Ignore the fact that it looks ugly as heck right now, but like the general idea is this is going to be my flounce layer over the top. So I'm going to have some pretty gathers going on here. It's still sitting a little bit too tight and I realize that's because like having this extra bit in the back that I've sewn, all of that volume is in the back and I realize that that's not going to help me much. So what I'm going to do is just go straight down here because I've also got way too much length on this as well. So I'm just going to split that down a little bit and that should give me more length. So I'm going to pull that up around to the front. I don't know how well you can see it in camera, but that's definitely giving me heaps more volume at like the front and the sides to work with to get those sort of pleat things happening. Now I've cut exactly the same shape except I've cut it into two parts. So it's the same sort of donut that's like longer on one side. And the reason is because I kind of like to have like a third layer that kind of goes like that and kind of gathers all up onto the one side. I think between this layer, and the base layer, that's plenty of volume, especially once I get some horsehair braid or something in this hem. All right, so I've got a couple of different options for trying to give this thing some volume. The first is horsehair braid, which is like this sort of plasticky stuff. It kind of looks like finger trap material. Basically, this is going to give like a really lovely structured wave, but the downside is it's really expensive. This is what it looks like. I did just like a little test run. So it's just sewn into the hemline there. And you can see you get those lovely structured waves going on and big fan of that. Looks great. The other option is a fishing line hem. I think it's also called like a lettuce hem. So this is this one and like it looks a little bit rattier, but that is because I haven't really done a proper job of these hemlines. But you can still see I'm still getting a lot of that beautiful volume coming through. And that is literally just fishing line that I have sewn into the hemline. It definitely gives like a less structured wave and more curl, I guess. I'm hoping it will look a little bit neater because I'm going to maybe put it inside some bias binding rather than having like, because I've just really done a crappy little hemline here. I just kind of wanted to see the different ways that these would give body. So my third option is going to be literal wire. So this is just like some cheap armature wire and I'm literally just going to poke it through the hemline of my little fishing line example and I'm going to see how this looks. So obviously the wire option gives a lot of structure. The interesting part is of course that I'll be able to bend it into the shapes that I want, which could give me some very interesting hemlines, but I would constantly have to correct it, I guess. The other option is I can combine like my thick fishing line with the horsehair braid, which I've just done for like this first little section here because it just provides, I guess, just even more volume.
So like a typical indecisive bisexual, I didn't decide between any of these. Instead, I did a combination inspiration. On my big circle skirt base layer, I basically had like 3 strands of the fishing line, which I very carefully encased within some bias binding. And I've just very carefully zigzag stitched that all around to create my hemline. This was incredibly slow going because that fishing line does kind of move around and you have to keep holding it in place to make sure it's properly encased within the binding. I also added in an incredibly lazy waistband, basically just pinning a big strap of elastic to the top where the waist is going to sit and just zigzag stitched around for like the 5th time this video, or maybe the 6th time. I am so sorry to all the seamstresses watching, but this lovely hemline at the bottom is actually looking wonderful. Could not be more pleased by how this turned out. Moving on to flounce layer number 1, and I'm going to repin this to my skirt first because I want to trim the edges of this just a little bit more to make that angle more extreme and to kind of visualize where some of these folds are going to sit. Flounce layer number 1. For this hemline, I'm using the horsehair braid and a piece of the fishing line. I think if you were aiming for neater stitches, you would do a straight stitch along this bias binding, but we are doing lazy illegal sewing techniques today, so I'm using zigzag stitching. It's just easier to capture the entire bias binding in one go. Second layer of flounces. For this one, I am using just bias binding and a piece of the armature wire. I was a little nervous going over this layer just to make sure I didn't break a needle on the armature wire, but I liked the effect enough that I went back with a piece of armature wire and just stuffed it into the hemline of the first layer too. This took a bit of time and I wish I'd thought of this before I did the entire hemline on the first layer, but I could already tell at this stage it was worth the extra effort because being able to move these hemlines around and manipulate how they sit is going to be so cool. And yeah, you can see what a difference it makes just with me pinning it to the mannequin here. Now, this was supposed to be a section where I'm kind of explaining to you a bunch of stuff. I don't even remember what I was supposed to be saying, but anyway, my microphone wasn't on this whole time, so let's just imagine that I'm saying something really intelligent and profound.
So far, all I've done is like pin these ruffle pieces to the mannequin. It looks fantastic. I've never done this before, guys. Like, I don't think I've ever made a ball gown unless you count my Stella.cosplay. I sure as heck have never done anything like this before. Like, this is really giving me like flower petals. I also just want to tell you guys, I'm having the best time making this. I really am. I think that it's exactly what I needed right now was to like work on an original design. So that I'm just having a real good time. Anyway, as I was pinning these down, I did kind of notice that like if I curled this a bit round, you have a bit of a point here at the front on either side. And I do kind of want to lean into that because I love the idea of these big, beautiful, voluptuous ruffles. And then just like a couple of points where that spiral kind of ends into like some sort of sharp point. Definitely kind of leaning into beautiful but dangerous sort of thing. And check out what I did with the back. Look at how good that looks. So obviously these longer pieces all come down into their own little points as well. And this is like my little back piece that I just kind of chucked together just to kind of fill that space. And it's also got a ton of little points. So I think in terms of like imagery, I'm definitely leaning into a combination of like round shapes coming into points at certain places, which kind of reminds me of like the thorn between roses. So this is kind of making me think of like a tail or something like that, or like a stinger for a scorpion or something. And keep in mind, most of these edges are going to be like just covered in various red laces and ribbony bits and beadwork, which I really want to emphasize on some of those points as well. Like it's sort of like the blood pooling into those little pointy bits.
It's now late into the night on the end of day 2, and before I call it a day, I'm gonna iron on some stabilizer to some of the offcut pieces from the cotton sateen. And these pieces are going to be my bodice, or my corset, or whatever you call it. Now, if there's ever a time you should use an actual pattern and measurements, it would be for a fitted bodice. Does that mean I'm gonna use one? Nah. But I've made vaguely bodice-shaped pieces of clothing so many times that I'm pretty confident just freehand sketching on the shape that I need. And because I've made so many before, I can kind of guesstimate roughly what size I'm gonna need based on all the ones I've made in the past. So I cut out 2 of these front panel pieces here. I'm sewing along to join them right sides together to do like a bag lining, which was kind of a mistake because then I had to go and join it to another piece and I'd kind of forgotten about that step. My side panel was yet again freehand sketched. I did put it against my front panel just to make sure I had the length right where it was going to join up. These pieces were also cut and sewn together with a bag lining, which again is not how you're supposed to do this because I have to sew them together anyway. I think in my head I was imagining that bag lining the pieces individually might give me some channels for the boning. For those of you watching that want to try and do this like the correct way, I really liked the video from Morgan Donna and this fantastic video from Sarah Spaceman too. Both links in the description below. But for me, it's past midnight, it's time to go to bed. This is close enough.
Good morning, my loves. I barely slept last night. Kind of woke up with like hatred in my heart, mostly just for winter because it is so freezing cold at the moment. And everyone always scoffs when Australians complain about the cold. But listen, we are deadly serious because all of our houses are basically glorified tents. There's no insulation happening. So right now I've got like 2 different thermal layers on my top and my bottom, some extra cardigans underneath this, a giant hoodie, and then my scarf, and I'm still cold. Anyway, if I sound like a sassy grandma for the whole day, that's why. So yesterday I got pretty far on the bodice just on vibes alone, so I'm pretty chuffed about that. But we've reached the point where I'm not going to be able to just operate on cosplayer Audacity alone because I can't just keep holding this up to myself where I'm wearing like 4 different layers and being like, oh yeah, that looks like a close enough fit. So the plan this morning is I'm going to try and like sew in a bunch of boning to this, and then I'm going to have to actually try it on, which I'm not looking forward to because it means, again, taking off the aforementioned bazillion layers. So there's 2 different kinds of boning I'm going to use for this garment. One of them is spiral steel boning, which is this stuff here. So it's literally just spiral of steel, I guess. And that's pretty standard for corset making. I think they usually use it a lot, particularly in the areas where it's to bend a lot. So it's like the hips. And I'm using it down the front of the bust line because it kind of has to curve, you know, over my bust. And this is actually the first time I've used spiral steel boning. Before, I've only ever used the zip tie method. And you can thank Sarah Spaceman for that one. Zip ties, especially like those thicker heavy duty ones, are basically just like a nice strip of like flat plastic that's got a bit of body to it but still allows for some flexibility. So it works really well for corsets. I've used it like once before in a belt, and we're doing the same thing here. And if you're wondering why I'm doing both spiral steel and zip ties, honestly the reason is just because I wanted to practice using spiral steel, but I also didn't want to use up very much of it because I'm saving that for a future project. So there's no practical reason why you would use both spiral steel and zip ties. Most people are just going to choose one or the other. I just happen to be using both because. All right, we're going to get the rest of this boning sewn in, and hopefully by the time I finish that and to try it on, the 3 cups of tea and tiny space heater that I've been running at 1,000,000 miles an hour will have warmed me up enough that I don't feel like I want to die when I take off my layers. I've cut myself a lovely piece of spiral steel boning. That is exactly the length that goes from like the top of the bust line to the bottom on my little bodice piece. We also have this little thing, which I think is like just the cap that you put at the top and bottom of the strand, and that basically serves to like protect the spiral steel from like having sharp edges that poke you. So I've got that just on top of that, and my understanding is that you just kind of like squeeze it together with some pliers and that kind of sets it in place. I guess the good thing is, even if like that little cap bit is not perfectly set on the top, because I'm going to be sewing in like either side to create like a channel for the boning, it should kind of just hold it in place anyway.
So I'm basically shoving my spiral steel piece into the lining and pushing it so it sits up against the seam between my front panel and my side panel. And then I'm just gonna sew down the other side of that one to hold it in place. It also turns out I'd underestimated how long I wanted this to be, like by a couple of millimeters. And I don't know if I'm doing it wrong, but it's a real pain in the butt to cut spiral steel boning, which is definitely making me lean more towards the zip ties.
So as I was pulling the end of this to just trim it just a tiny little bit because it was a tiny little bit too long, I pulled it out a little tiny bit of the boning channel I just made, and the other end that I'd already put the little cap on, the cap came off, so it's sort of like stuck. It's in here, like there's just like an end in here, and I don't know how to get that out. So terrible solution idea. I've actually cut a tiny little bit of the boning channel at the back here, and I'm just gonna try and like squeeze the little cap down a tiny bit, just enough to reach that area so I can like pull it out of the boning channel. I think I've just about got it. It's just poking through here, so if I can just, hang on, where's my pliers? Hey! Alright, so I got my little tiny freaking cap out. That was a huge pain in the butt and I'm already grumpy. And now it does mean that I have like a bit of an ugly little tear at the back, but that's at the back, so no one's gonna see it. No one will know it's there, aside from all you guys now, because I've told you. But you can keep a secret, right?
So after recapping my spiral steel piece and shoving it back down the channel, I'm doing the same thing with the zip ties. They're each getting put into the lining alongside a seam and sewing down either side of it to make sure that that boning is going to stay in place. Here at the back where it's going to join up, I'm basically doing 2 boning channels right next to each other with a very small gap in between where I'm going to put some eyelets. And then I'm pretty much putting a separate boning piece alongside every other seam that I had in this. I think there are about 13 boning pieces all up, and that's That's an odd number because I had this one really long, really thick zip tie that I put right down the middle. Because the bottom of my corset has this lovely pointed shape, I wanted part of the boning to come down all the way just to support that shape and make sure it doesn't roll up. And honestly, looking over everything, it's not bad. I've only ever made one boned corset before, which was nothing like this, so this is all still new territory for me.
All right, I've been procrastinating as long as I can. I'm now back in single layers, and this sucks, so let's get it over with. So that's pretty much where it's gonna be sitting, and that's kind of what I wanted. Like, this right now is coming just up over my hips, which I didn't measure for, but I actually think that that's perfect. I think that once I get this all cinched in, that should be sitting nicely. Like, everything looks pretty even. Nothing's like puckering or moving around too much. I seem to have given myself enough room at the back there that, like, once I get some, what are they called? Rivets? Eyelets. Once I get some eyelets in the back there, hopefully I have still given myself enough room to like properly cinch myself in there, because I do want to get like a little bit of a snatched waist on the top here. Less important than the snatched waist is the element that I want this to be as structurally sound as possible, because it is going to be a support garment that's going to help take the weight of all of those skirts. And if I end up having this whole thing covered in like lace and beads, I'm going to need that support. So I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I get to go try out a new toy that I got recently for the first time. The bad news is I have to go to the shed for that, and that means going outside in the cold. Okay, so just bear with me while I put like 5 billion layers back on, and then we'll do that. So this is my fancy new toy. This is a grommet press, and I've only used it a handful of times so far, but it is so freaking cool. It literally does what it says on the tin. It presses in grommets, which does mean that anytime you want to chuck in like an eyelet or a grommet, or even like punch a hole, you have to sit there with like a hammer and stuff like that, which makes it way quieter, which I'm definitely a big fan of. So this little attachment that I've got here is actually a hole punch, and this is just for 3mm holes, nice little ones. And I'm just gonna punch a bunch of holes between those two little sections at the back of my corset.
And that's how I learned I wasn't setting up my tripod properly.
Okay, I have a lovely little row of holes now. Now these are just 3mm holes, but my grommets are 6mm. And the reason why I've kept these holes quite smaller is because I want to widen them using like an awl or I think it's like a straight pick as well, because that way, apparently if you push the fibers aside to make the hole rather than just cut it entirely, it means that there's not as much chance the fiber's just going to pull out from the side of the eyelet. So I'm going to try and shove this through a little bit, and it's just going to push those fibers to the side. All right, so I'm going to take out my little hole cutting set, and instead I'm going to put in my grommet press set, which is like these two little bits. So that goes in there. This one screws in here, and then I have a washer over that, and then I think that's it, all there is to it. And then we just... And that worked pretty well. There is like splitting at the sides here, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to do that or not, but there's no sharp edges as far as I can tell. Okay, I guess I'm just gonna do the rest of those now.
As expensive as this press was, I'm so glad that I got it. I've always avoided using eyelets in all of my cosplays just because I really hate using like the thing where you have to hammer it in. This bad boy is gonna get so much use from me now. I do still have to put quite a lot of force down, which is probably less of an issue if I'm like standing up or have it like actually attached to a desk. Anyway, to match up the other side, I just kind of held it up to the existing grommets and marked it with a pencil. And honestly, the second side looked a fair bit neater, and I think that's just because I'm getting used to using it. With all of my eyelets looking lovely, I'm starting to thread up my corset using some red ribbon. This is some fairly sturdy satin ribbon. Having it be durable is probably the most important thing for me. I don't really want this ribbon snapping while I'm trying to do up my corset. Oh, and you might notice that I'm leaving these two little loops on either side around the middle. These are called bunny ears, and they're essentially where I'm going to pull to tighten the corset. Okay, I'm back in my single layers and having a bad time. So let's just get this over with, hey, so I can put on all my clothes again. So I gotta be honest here, guys, considering all of this and this bodice, I have made both of these with no patterns, no measurements. This is all just mucking around, and I think that's about as good as you could possibly ask for, considering that I don't use either of those actual methods that you're supposed to use when you're sewing.
So the fact that this has quite a strong triangular shape and isn't like super curvaceous around my waist and around my bust, that is intentional, because for starters, you're gonna have a ton of curvaceous things coming out over the hips here anyway. And for the bust, I kind of wanted to stay really triangular and have this kind of shape going on. And all of this is gonna be just completely swathed in lace and crystals and beads, and it's gonna be a lot going on up here. So I really didn't need to worry too much about like getting a perfect curve over this. So I love this shape. It's fitting really well. I had exactly the right amount of laces. I can't believe how well this has worked like so quickly. All right, it is time to decorate this bad boy, which means just using up all of the red that I have. Now, I think my plan is going from the bottom to the top. I'm going to layer up all the lace and then start on any beadwork or crystals and stuff like that, because I don't know how much beads and crystals these middle parts are going to be able to take before I sort of weigh this down, because I don't want to lose these lovely swooshes. My plan for the lace is that I went to buy some more lace. That is because I realized that none of the lace I have is really in large enough quantities to cover all of the edges for this dress. So I went to a local place that I didn't know existed until a couple of days ago, and someone recommended it to me. So shout out to Kim Arn Fabrics, because I got this trim for like $1 a meter. So I bought 30 meters of it. So at least I have one consistent trim that'll go on everything. I also have 20 meters of this stuff, which I think looks kind of boring as is. My plan is I'm going to layer up both of those laces on absolutely all of this. And then I'm just gonna start sewing on things until I'm happy with how it looks, basically.
Actually, before I get stuck into the trims, I have all of this lace left over from one of my previous cosplays. I'm gonna start cutting out all of these individual little lace appliques from it, because I don't know if you guys have ever tried to buy little pieces of lace applique, but you'd be looking at like $4 to $5 for a single piece. They are outrageously expensive. So I know this is gonna be a lot of work cutting out each piece individually, trying to get all of that tulle off, but definitely worth it for the money I save. My plan is to use these pieces to start creating some texture and layers at the bottom of the skirt. Once again, no pins, no measurements. I just start layering them down and just sewing them together one by one. And let me tell you, this took forever. Not just because, of course, that base skirt is massive, so having to like manage all of that fabric on either side and make sure that whole giant piece of fabric isn't trying to slide out of the sewing machine. Anyway, we got there eventually. To sew down the top section of the applique, I actually changed over for invisible thread, which is super finicky to work with. It's just so tiny and doesn't really move or behave like regular thread does. But I think plain red thread would have created like a visible border here at the top, and I want that part to start fading into the white. And honestly, white thread would have had the same problem. It would be very visible on top of the red applique.
Good morning. It is day 4, I think. I definitely slept better last night. Thank you for asking. It is still freezing cold, so I am yet again in another layer. I think we're just gonna have to accept that this video, you guys are just getting a wonderful look at all the coziest parts of my wardrobe. Anyway, I realized something this morning. I have 2 days less than I thought I did to finish this dress, because I was accidentally calculating in the day of the photo shoot as an option, and I'm not going to be able to do any work on it that day because the photo shoot starts in the morning. And then another day this week, I have a different commitment, so I won't be crafting that day. So I actually literally only have 7 days total, including the days that I've already been working to finish this dress. So I'm gonna have to get a move on with this. The silver lining is now I can truthfully say I made this vampire ball gown in 7 days, and that's gonna make for like a great thumbnail or title for this video at least. You gotta keep those algorithm gods happy. So with that first line of lace along the bottom of the circle skirt sewn on, I've got a couple more pieces of the applique that I'm gonna put on to like bring it up the dress a little bit.
Since I wanted to space these ones out evenly along the skirt, sadly I did have to pin these ones in place before I sewed them. Excuse me? Where did this giant stain come from? I haven't done anything, but oh my god, it's probably like rubbed up against a corner of my room or something. Emergency plan. I'm gonna try some like stain remover stuff so I don't have to wash this whole damn skirt, and then I might actually be able to position some of these and just kind of like skip these two and stick one right here so it covers up part of whatever stain remains after this. Genius. Okay, the most mildly infuriating thing ever, right, is all of these I cut out of the applique without really measuring how many I was gonna need, and I had exactly enough to line all the way through, including these bits. -1. I needed to cut out one more applique to have completely guesstimated exactly how many I need for this skirt. Luckily, it wasn't the last of the lace entirely, so I was just able to cut out some more to replace it.
So I think that was 67 total pieces of applique later that I've used to like build up the bottom of this skirt here, and it's looking very lovely if I do say so myself. I actually want to break out a little bit of red fabric paint and paint not only through the bottom of this hem where some of that white is showing, but also up as a guide for where I'm going to satin stitch later for the vines. I also just really like painting, so I wanted an excuse to use fabric paint because this is my ball gown and I'll do it however I please.
Once again, I'm back to hijacking the lounge room, and in hindsight, this flimsy drop sheet is not nearly enough protection for that carpet. Honestly, this whole costume, I didn't realize how much I've been tempting fate to have something go wrong. But so far so good, so I'm just gonna keep pushing my luck. The fabric paint I'm using is a jacquard airbrush paint, which has a lovely flowy consistency. I actually watered it down even further just so it would soak into the fabric a bit more. And I'm using it to paint just like a bunch of vines and like little swirls and wattles and flower buds and things like that all the way up, as well as going over the whole hemline. Now I know all of that paint line work doesn't quite look right next to the lace applique, but this is definitely a case of trust the process. My plan is to just layer up a bunch more stuff so it'll eventually all kind of blend together. Now I'm new to this stuff, but apparently ironing it makes this color fast and basically just sets the dye. Once again, I am really pushing my luck with the sleep debt, but I'm going to be cutting out some more appliques into the wee hours of the morning tonight. I have a couple of sample pieces of this slightly darker red lace that I'm cutting out all of these little flowers from. Hopefully these smaller pieces will provide a bit of color variation to the bright red applique I've already got on the dress, and also give me something else to sort of blend through where the painted parts are.
Day 5, and I just got completely sick of living in glorified pajamas, so I have put on real clothes today for a change. Rest assured, I am wearing my thermaliest of thermals underneath all this still. Anyway, since I spent the majority of yesterday just painting the bottom layer and then cutting out tiny appliques out of my lace, I'm a little bit further behind than I was expecting. By the end of today, I really need to have the full skirt done because I need day 6 to be entirely about decorating the bodice and whatever kind of sleeves I want. And day 7, I'm going to be doing all of my beadwork and the mask and the wig, so I don't have much time to be mucking around with the skirt. Realizing that, I decided to ditch the idea of doing any like top stitching, satin stitching sort of thing for decoration on the bottom layer, because realistically with the paint, I don't think it needs it. I am going to use a bunch of those appliques and literally just glue them down around that bottom layer just to kind of help blend the paint sections into the applique sections a little bit. And I do plan on going back over those at a later stage and like actually stitching them down properly rather than just relying on some fabric glue to hold them to the actual skirt. But that is a problem for future Charlotte. I don't have time to do that to every single one of those tiny little appliques.
While we're down here, I took a couple of hours to add some extra little crystals. This is mostly, I guess, to kind of supplement the beadwork I'm going to add later on. While my various paints and glues were drying, I'm going to start adding some lace to my little flounce layers. But that thicker lace layer was on the back side of my flounces. I decided against using that thicker lace on the front and instead opted to paint the hem in and then just add some texture and mottled sort of blendy stuff going on with the paint instead. Honestly, my decision to use this was less about the fact that it looked really good and more just because I was having a good time with it.
It's just occurred to me that I have painted 3 out of the 5 of my skirt pieces using some very permanent and very drippy red fabric paint while wearing some rather nice clothes with no protection over it. And the fact that I've gotten this far without dripping any on me is a miracle, honestly. The cosplay gods are looking out for me today, but I'm gonna go put an apron on for my last 2. I'm not gonna push my luck.
Now, I know I said I didn't want to use any like literal blood splatters or blood soaking sort of textures, but my hope is a lot of this sort of like dot mottled texture will look a little bit more subtle once I have some lace laid over it and some beadwork.
So foresight is not usually a quality I possess very much of, but at least this time round, I remembered to dye a bunch of those white laces in advance rather than trying to dye them at the time that I needed to be sewing them on. So I didn't know what any of them were in terms of fiber content, so I just chucked them all in a vat of like the all-purpose RIT dye. So these ones came out this horrendous fleshy peachy color, kind of like a raw chicken breast, which tells me that these two are probably some sort of synthetic fiber, but that was just not very successful, so we're just ditching those laces. And then these two worked too well and obviously just soaked up all of the wine colored dye to the point where like they're this weird sort of burgundy the purple color, and again, completely useless for this particular project. It's actually a great coincidence that those two laces are the ones that landed stuck on the shelf, because I don't actually think I'm finished with those laces yet.
So basically, since I had so much luck using that jacquard red dye, I just literally soaked these laces in that dye and then laid them out on a bit of wax paper to dry off. And to be honest, at this stage, the color is pretty promising. We've got a beautiful, lush, bright red. All we can really do is wait for them to dry off. Back to my flounce layer, where this red lace was at the back of the flounce, I decided to like cut that in strips and glue it down gradually. Just because it's such a straight piece of lace, it wasn't coping too well over those curves. So cutting some gradual notches into it and gluing it down seemed to help. If I had more time and or dignity and self-respect, I would be doing this with stitching rather than fabric glue. But I don't really have any of those, so we're just gluing everything down. This lace is also disguising that horsehair, since because of those flounces, you are going to see a fair bit of the underside. Back to the top layer, I'm going to add this slightly more decorative lace trim around the outside. I have not forgotten that these flounce layers have a wire in the hem, so I'm very carefully using my zigzag stitch to make sure I don't hit it. That said, in total on this project, I think I broke 3 to 4 needles, so I didn't really succeed in that the whole time. Now my smaller flouncy pieces are getting this slightly smaller trim as well, only really because I don't think I have enough of that more decorative one to go all the way around these.
It is day 6 and look at this dress. Look at this. Like, oh my god, all I've done so far is like pin these in place. Nothing is sewn together yet, but just seeing all this on the mannequin, it's very reassuring, and it's given me like a second wind, because like in terms of textures, this is exactly the kind of thing that I had in mind. I would like this to be a little bit more detailed. Like I can tell from afar that it just looks like a very solid thin line, and I want that to be more textured and maybe a little bit thicker with the red, but I'm not going to muck around with that just yet because it is day 6, which means I have today and tomorrow, and that is it. So for now, I'm just going to try and get the bodice all decorated up, and I want to do something either shoulders or sleeves or whatnot. Like with everything with this dress so far, I'm not going to do any measurements or patterns or like formal planning. I think I'm just going to start vibing and see what comes of it. So I'm going to start with like a neck piece and then work my way out to the big fanny collar that I have in mind, and we'll just see how it goes.
Okay, so I kind of want to do like a V-shaped collar, but I can't remember how necks work in terms of shape, so I'm literally going to make myself a duct tape pattern. Basically, I'm covering my mannequin in cling wrap and then tape, and then using that essentially as my guide, I can draw the shape I want on the mannequin and then cut it off the mannequin so that I can then lay that shape flat and see what kind of pattern I need. And of course, that means using my signature fragile tape. At this stage, it's basically featuring in every single one of my projects. And you've probably noticed I'm using this opportunity to create like a shoulder piece as well. Using my little duct tape piece as a guide, I'm just going to trace this onto some of my leftover cotton sateen. I want this piece to have a lot of structure to it, like the corset, so I'm cutting out one piece. The second piece I'm going to bag line this one with is some of the leftover with the iron-on stabilizer attached. So once again, we have the right sides together and just sewing a straight stitch down the sides. I'm leaving both ends unstitched. This is essentially where I'm going to turn it inside out.
Now this is one of the best things I've ever spent money on. This is a loop turner, and essentially like when you have to like turn things inside out when you're bag lining, it basically helps you with that, and it's just so useful, honestly. So you push it through the thing that you need to turn inside out, which is often like a spaghetti strap or something really thin, and then you've got this little tiny hook sort of thing on one end, and that is going to catch the edge of the fabric here. So that's literally just hooked onto the edge of the fabric there, and then essentially it's going to pull that, like just catch that end so I can pull it all the way through inside out. Come on, you daft thing. Oh my god, why is this not working? I swear usually the loop turners are very useful, but something is not happening here. Yeah, all right, we're doing this one by hand, but I promise you a loop turner is usually very useful, especially for turning things out like straps. Just apparently not today, so I'm just gonna try and manually do this.
Which honestly turned out to be really hard. I had to get some pliers in to help me, and even then it was definitely a struggle. I have a feeling the combination of like a very stiff layer with stabilizer plus us trying to pull it through a very small hole was not a good combination, but we got there in the end.
I feel like I somehow made this piece way more complicated than it needs to be, considering it's literally just a V of fabric, but it is what it is. Anyway, I've sewn a bunch of lines through the center just to kind of reinforce it and keep it nice and I guess flat. And what I've basically done is chuck some rivets at the back here and a big piece of like hat elastic with a little bead on the end here, which is literally just so that like I can put this over my neck and I can pull this and then I can tie that at the back and it's sitting exactly where it needs to. So once this gets completely covered in beads, even if I've got like long nails on or something like that, it should be pretty easy to get on and off. Next we got this piece, which I'm somehow going to turn into like a bolero shoulder jacket thing.
I used my duct tape pattern once again to trace out this shape here onto some cotton sateen and did a super basic bag lining once again. I sewed this up to seal it at the top and the bottom, and I left the sleeves open so I could turn it inside out that way.
Okay, I have the world's most rushed, crappy little bolero, but it's gonna serve its purpose. I tried this on a couple of times and adjusted it. I did make it like slightly too wide across the shoulders, which is why I've got this great big ugly section in the middle here where basically I just kind of brought it in a tiny bit to take off some of that width. For the part that goes under the arms, rather than making anything resembling actual sleeves, this is like peak laziness. I've just sewn a tiny bit of hat elastic from this bit to this bit that goes under the arm here to hold it on. And I actually ran out of the white bias binding, but I do have a ton of red bias binding. And it occurred to me that I should have been using that the whole time since I painted all of my edges red anyway. So that would have saved me a lot of work, but that's kind of one of the downsides of making up a design as you go along instead of planning it in advance. Anyway, that's how that goes on, and essentially that's just going to be the spot that holds a bunch of my little pieces that I made. So I decided against going for like a full upright collar. I kind of wanted to replicate more of these sort of like swirly shapes. So instead, in my satin, I cut out just like freehanded these sort of shapes, which are similar shapes to what I used for these pieces down here. And my thoughts are that I'm going to pin them up over the shoulders and kind of create like a ruffled cape almost. So I got two big pieces like this and two little tiny pieces like this. So my initial thoughts were to pin everything on kind of something like this, but something about these shapes were just not doing it for me. That said, this at the back looks freaking awesome. So mucking around with the placement, I turned this piece here back to front. So I have this lovely long section that comes down at the front over the shoulder from this curve here. And then this second piece can kind of sit over the top with that point again. And I really like that. That's what happens when you get cheap mannequins. It just keeps sliding further down. Anyway, you get the idea. And then of course, everything on the top of the shoulder here and down the neck is going to be so decorated with just tons of lace and crystals and beads. So I think it'll just tie everything together beautifully.
Now I was all too happy to break out that fabric paint again. I wasn't expecting to use it quite as much as I ended up doing so, but it's just so satisfying and I really love the texture that it gave. So I just kind of let loose on the collar piece and then on my shoulder pieces as well and on the corset, and since I was on a roll I went back over some of the skirt pieces as well. I found once the paint dried that it kind of came out with like a bit of a peachy tone, so I went back over it with some of the red that was mixed with the black just for a slightly darker tone. The end of the night is fast approaching, so the last little step is chucking on a bit of this lace onto my collar piece. Even before the beadwork, this is looking fantastic.
Alright you guys, this is it. This is the last day that I have to work on this. We are entering the home stretch. The last lap. The final countdown. I'm so sorry. So there's a lot to get through today and I'm already in Struggle Town a little bit because I was up till like 3:30 a.m. last night. Not entirely on purpose, I just kind of got into the groove while I was crafting and didn't notice the time go by, which is genuinely a sign of how much I'm enjoying working on this. Like I really am. This has kind of revitalized me a little bit. Also, quick side note, but how freaking good is this looking already? Like if this looks as good on me as it does on the mannequin, I'm gonna be too powerful. Anyway, I added all the extra trim around like these capelet pieces, around the corset, and I added a fair bit more of the painty texture. Speaking of trim, all of my lace dried, the stuff that I was painting up to try and get into like that nice red color. It doesn't actually look too bad in the camera, but in person I can see that the red has come up to be like a very muddy burgundy sort of tone. It's not really the bright reds that I was going for, and I think that might just be because of course we had like those failed wine colored dyes dyes that I tried underneath it. So sadly for now, these are getting yeeted to the purgatory of my crafting stash, and I'm sure I'll find a use for them at another stage in like a year or two or something. During my late night crafting bender, I also cut out even more tiny little applique pieces. I have literally hundreds of these now, and they're the same ones that I used on the bottom of my dress here, but I've cut out even smaller individual pieces. And my plan is to use them on some areas to build up some texture, like on the top of the shoulders and maybe the top of the corset, for example. And I started working on my mask, since this is technically a masquerade as well. Now, my plan was to use Warbler for my mask. Sadly, I forgot that I used up the last of my Warbler, even my tiny scrap pieces, on a previous project that I'd forgotten about. Ironically, was also a mask. And just to take that opportunity to show off a little bit, this is the mask in question that I made, which is supposed to be like a slightly terrifying phoenix inspired mask. Definitely not one that suits this dress, but it does kind of slap, if I do say so myself. Now, usually for like Warbler or EVA foam, I would order all that from Lumins Workshop, which is a fantastic cosplay supplier right here in Australia. But I need this to be ready and complete within the next 24 hours. So I needed to look at some alternative options. So plan B was literally just made with some like cheap craft foam and some armature wire through here to keep the shape. And so this is how it's looking after like a couple of layers of Plastidip and then some spray paint. And to be honest, I just wasn't feeling it. Like, I'm running entirely off vibes for this project, and this was not the vibe for me. Don't get me wrong, it's not terrible, it just doesn't quite match the feeling of the ball gown. So my backup plan, I already had this metal mask like in my crafting stash, and all I've done so far is spray it with a couple of layers of Plastidip and then of course a lovely red coat. And it does feel a little bit generic just because it is like one of those mass-produced things that cost like $5. But the filigree laciness I think does work a little bit better with the ball gown, and I can spice it up with some beads and crystals as well. And the fact that this mask is metal is going to be a huge advantage because it's magnetic, which means that I can essentially put some magnets into the netting of the wig, and we can ditch this ugly strap, and essentially this is going to be able to magnet on and off my face as I need it. Also, RIP to my mannequin head, I had my mask pinned to it while I was spray painting, and I entirely forgot about the fact that spray paint melts into the styrofoam. So this is thoroughly destroyed. It does look kind of badass though. It's kind of giving me luchador vibes. This is my wig that I'm going to be wearing on the shoot, and for my magnets, I have these little tiny ones here. These are super strong magnets, and because I've got that hole in the middle, I'm hoping that I can use that to sew them into the wig. So how I'm going to do this, I've got one here. I'm going to place that just under this section here that's sitting against my temples, roughly where I think it's going to need to be for the wig. And I'm going to place one more on the outside of that. And because there's a magnet on either side, that should kind of hold it in place. And that will allow me to kind of slide it up or down as needed on here. All right, so now I've got 2 magnets here and 2 magnets here. And my plan is I'm literally just going to chuck this on there, and those magnets are instantly going to attract that and hold it in place. And right now it's sitting a little too low, but because these magnets, I can kind of slide them up a little bit. Okay, so that is sitting pretty much exactly where I'm going to want it. So that means that I can very carefully take the mask off, because I want to take the mask off while those magnets stay in place on the underside there. So I'm going to get my hand under there, hold those magnets, pull that mask away. I'm going to do the same on the other side. So theoretically now, those magnets are kind of holding themselves on through that little wig cap section. I can take this off because I've got the magnets either side. That's held on in exactly the place that I need it. So now I can sew that in place.
Something I didn't anticipate is the needle is also metal, so it kept wanting to like magnetize back to the magnet, which just made it a little bit silly to sew with. Anyway, I basically just did a bunch of different stitches through every direction that I could using this little hole in the middle of the magnet. I don't really expect them to move very much, but I just want to make sure that they're reinforced and are going to stay put.
Okay, now if I got the magnet position right, I should be able to take this on and off whenever I need to. So, hey, there we go. That's not going anywhere. That is fantastic. Okay, and then I can just essentially take it on and off whenever I need to. I think you could theoretically do this with like non-metal masks as well. You would just have to sew a magnet into that mask that you have, as well as the wig net. All right, it's time to decorate this thing. And I think one of the first things I want to do is I want to see if it looks any good with like a veil of some sort over the eye holes, because I feel like the eye holes are like a little bit too small and they look kind of awkward. I want to try something, so bear with me. All right, so this is my thought and I'm kind of digging it. It's basically just just like a piece of red lace that I've placed behind the mask to cover that eye hole. And I think it kind of adds like an air of mystery to it. And because this mask is going to be easy for me to take on and off, if I want to have some shots that show some cool eye makeup, I can do that. The only thing with this though is it means I'm not going to be able to have really long, big fake eyelashes. But I think that's okay with me, honestly, because I think that looks really kind of cool. So all I did there was place this behind here. So I think if I just get a little bit of glue around the very edge of the metal eye shape and then just glue that down and cut off the excess, that should really be enough.
Which is exactly what I did. It was just a lot messier than I expected. Partly because the rim around the eyes is so skinny that there's not really much to put the glue on. And it was really hard to get into these gaps to actually cut off the excess. But after a little bit of wrestling, we got it sorted. And I pried off a bunch of gemstones that were existing on the mask. That's why I've got these little silver patches. So to decorate up this mask, I really wanted to just tie a bunch of the different beads and crystals to it. So using a combination of thread, wire, and a lot of glue, I just started layering these up. Since I couldn't really sew that much besides tying some string around the metal, most of the decoration here was just the flat back crystals. I did make some awesome little dangly pieces just by threading a bunch of beads onto some thin wire. It's definitely giving the vibes of like blood dripping down, but still keeping it like figurative and not literal. So these are called head pins, and shout out to Wholesale Beads who told me about this. I had no idea. It's just a pin with like a head at the end so that it stops the beads falling off, and you can just thread a bunch on, use some pliers to loop the end, and then you've got a perfect little drop shape you can sew onto things. And at this moment, I decided I was going to use so many of these because I loved the effect. It was such a lovely way of creating like some more texture and dimension hanging off all of my pieces. Oh, and check out this big brain moment I had realizing I can use this little silicone mold as a way to hold all of my different bead shapes and sizes so I can see them all at once. I know you can buy bead organizers, but I didn't want to spend the money or waste the plastic. I've sewed this one through a few times with some extra strong thread and just tying it off at the back. Some of these really tiny beads didn't fit through any of my needles, so this really thin jewelry wire I had came in clutch. I decided to use it to create some little hanging sections between those little drops. My hope is using wire over thread in these sections will help it hold some of that curve shape. And the wire is thin enough I can sew with it like I would with a needle and thread. I think if I decide to keep doing beadwork in the future, I'm gonna have to invest in some proper tools. Because after a full day of handling these tiny beads, my hands were just cramping up from trying to hold such tiny little objects. I think you're supposed to have like a scooping motion with a pin or wire to pick up the beads. It didn't always work for me, so sometimes it was just a case of picking them up one by one. Now this next part was the fun part. Basically, I wanted to decorate the main piece with just clusters of beads, so I'm sewing them on 1, 2, or even 3 clusters at a time. Now as I went, I was trying to keep the bead choices relatively random, but sort of favoring the larger ones towards the middle and the center, and as I'm going out towards the edges, opting for slightly smaller beads or smaller clusters of just 1 or 2. Adding in amongst the beadwork a bunch of flat back crystals. And holy heck, you guys, look at how cool this looks. This is even better than what I'd envisioned in my head. I had absolutely no time to do any commentary as I was going with this one, so you're stuck with voiceover Charlotte for now. Basically, I have taken my shoulder piece off the mannequin with the pin still holding those little swirly bits in place, and I've just sewn them with a straight stitch straight to my little bolero piece. Yes, I'm aware that is not how you do that, but again, I had like hours left and I'd crunched so much into this last bit of time. So we're back to using illegal cosplay cheat codes, and I am just gluing trim over this filthy stitch line. Honestly, this trim going into these appliques that I used to cover up the last of them and add some more decoration, I'm actually pretty happy with how this looked anyway. I think using the applique kind of tied the very bottom of the skirt back to the very top. I had the tiniest portion of this trim left, so I am gluing it to the bottom of my corset. I thought this extra trim might help sort of mirror that neck piece. And since I loved those little drops that I made the first time with these bee-cone beads, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, I am going to make a ton more of them because we're going to put it all over the corset and on all the little skirt and shoulder pieces too. And so the bedazzling and beading continued on the top of the corset towards the bottom, once again pulling those bee clusters towards that point. And guess what? We're doing it all again on all the shoulder pieces, just with a few less of the dangly pieces. And I added a few larger beads around the appliques just to kind of tie it in.
You guys, look at this! I at this! What the hell? Oh my god, like I'm so happy with how this is looking. There's obviously like little things that I would change if I did it again or had like a bazillion hours and $1 million to do it. But like considering time and budget, this is 7 days. I know I've said it before and you're gonna hear me say it again, but I am just immensely happy and I've had so much fun on this project and it's revitalized me in a way that I just don't have quite words for. Like I feel like the creativeness in my brain has had a bit of a renaissance. It's bugging me a little bit that I didn't try on the corset on its own without the skirt because the lacing does go like all the way close at the back, which is not a bad thing. Like it's comfy, I don't have to tight lace it, but I would have liked to have a bit of a gap there so I have the option of adjusting it to go tighter if I want to.
It is long past midnight on the last day. There needs to be a word that's stronger than just rushing, like hyper rushing, because that is what I'm doing to this skirt at this point. I took this off my mannequin with the pins still in place, so I know exactly where I'm sewing in my flounces. And while I didn't film it because again, I am rushing so hard at this point, I added some extra beadwork and crystals to the points on the front of the skirt. Alright, it's the morning of the shoot. This is too early for anyone to be awake. It's fine, it's 8 o'clock. It's just too early for me because I was up till 2 a.m. doing like the last minute crafting so that the dress is in a state where it is wearable. There's still like a lot of unfinished edges and things, but it'll look good in photos. I can worry about the other elements later. I did get out some contact lenses for this one. I think that was a little over ambitious. I don't think my eyes are going to be able to take those today. So I'm just gonna do some nice makeup with some red lips. Honestly, I don't think it needs to be super complicated because I've got a giant freaking ball gown and also because I'm wearing a mask for a lot of it. So we're just gonna do some nice makeup and some red eyes and some red lips. With my gown precariously packed in a suitcase, I headed to the George Ballroom in St. Kilda. And hey, now there's nothing else to it but to show you how it went. Oh my god, you guys, this location was so awesome. I feel like Australia just doesn't have that many old classical looking buildings like America or Europe does. So this was just a real treat for me. My fellow cosplayer Katie and I had sort of semi-coordinated with the dark and light theme and the lace over the eyes. That means I can eat food. Yes, to the spits.
That looks great.
Thank you. I think you can absolutely tell watching some of this footage that I have no idea how to move in a ball gown. Okay, this part doesn't actually count. I just got a real bad leg cramp. It'll take some getting used to, but I think I kind of really like ball gowns now. Now, I might still be a little bit awkward in how I move in them, but damn, I must say I'm pretty good at posing in them. You know, if I do say so myself.
Happens when someone knows how to dance and someone has absolutely no clue what's going on.
Oh, and you guys, I haven't even talked about the other cosplayers and photographers. Everyone brought their A game. And there's an energy to a big group cosplay shoot that you don't get on your own. A mix of cosplays based on characters and people making entirely original concept. Everything from Faye to Phantom of the Opera with the most beautiful trims and fabrics you could possibly imagine. It was a wonderful mix of people using bought pieces they'd styled themselves to elevate them, modifying long lost pieces from op shops or from the back of someone's wardrobe, and some fellow masochists like me that made most of it from scratch.
So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, that freaking ruled. I loved this project so much. I had a great time doing it, as you can probably tell. I really needed that change of pace into that more original design and fantasy element. I only lament that I didn't have more time to work on this, and I have no one to blame for that but myself. This one needs a lot of improvements and reinforcements and things like that I'm gonna add at a later stage, like fixing up some of those terrible seams, stitching down some of the elements that I just slapped on with some glue, and I still have like 2/3 of my beads left that I want to just cover everything with, because I didn't do anywhere near as much beadwork and crystals as I was hoping for, just because I ran out of time. And I did absolutely zero styling on the wig, and it kind of shows. Look, wigs and hairstyling is still one of my major weak spots. I'm working on it. But all of those things are future Charlotte's problem. I had a ball making this, pun absolutely intended. Huge thank you to Guitarpug for organizing such an amazing photo shoot event, and to the incredible volunteers and other cosplayers that did so much work at the event to make sure everything was running smoothly. Huge props to the other cosplayers and photographers at the event, all of which are in the description below. I appreciate you guys so much for putting up with me happily waddling around with my tripod for all the behind the scenes footage, trying and probably failing not to get in the way. Huge shout out to my ultimate supporters. These are my top tier people on Patreon: Artemis, Dakota, Fluky, Rakishan, Residual Images, Robert Mischief, Tamara, Tim, and Yuri. And a massive thank you to these other amazing Patreon supporters whose names are appearing on screen now. Look at all these amazing names. All of these people must be so handsome and or beautiful, funny, and smart. If you want to be funny, smart, handsome, and or beautiful just like these guys, come and join us over on Patreon. I post previews, behind the scenes, work in progress, and other bits and pieces. And joining my Patreon is the best way that you can support me to keep making ridiculous projects like this. But even if you're here liking, subscribing, commenting, all those good things that make the YouTube algorithm happy, you are also helping me. So thank you very, very much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!